Okay, let's unpack this. We're about to plunge into one of the most, well, explosive and foundational cultural shifts in European prehistory. A transformation so vast, it basically redefined the continent's genetics, its social structure, and its language map.
We're talking about the Corded Ware Culture, or CWC. It spans that really critical period from, let's say, around 3000 BC down to about 2350 BC.
Right.
And this 700-year window, it's really the hinge point between the late Neolithic and the start of the European early Bronze Age. It's an era where the old ways kind of died out and the new blueprint for Europe was really established.
And the reason the CWC matters so much, it isn't just because of its amazing archaeological footprint, though. I mean, it is huge, right?
Absolutely massive.
But because it's the overwhelmingly likely vector for the massive spread of Indo-European languages across Central and Northern Europe, and even deep into Asia.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to explore the origins of this culture, especially its complicated, sometimes contradictory relationship with the powerful Yamnaya culture.
Yeah.
And look at how modern genetics fundamentally rewrote the story of this huge continental transformation.
Yeah, and we've got a deep stack of research here. We're focusing on the refined chronology, the astonishing geography, the key genetic markers that really caused a scientific upheaval, and the competing linguistic models trying to explain who spoke what and when.
It sounds like for anyone interested in European deep history, this is the pivotal moment. The one that changed everything.
It really is.
So let's jump in. We probably need to start with the basics. What, geographically and chronologically, was the Corded Ware culture?
Okay,
So the nomenclature itself, the name, it tells the story, right?
Yeah.
Because the CWC goes by at least 3 major names.
That's right.
And each one is based on a specific piece of their material culture or a unique social practice.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. The primary name, Corded Ware Culture, that comes directly from their characteristic pottery. It was first introduced by the German archaeologist Friedrich Klopfleisch back in 1883.
Okay.
He coined the German term Schnurkeramik Kultur, and it refers to these distinctive, often quite beautiful cord-like impressions or ornamentation that they pressed into the wet clay of their pots before firing.
It seems almost absurd that an entire pan-continental culture gets defined by a pottery imprint.
It does, doesn't it?
But I guess it speaks to how widespread and maybe uniform that single cultural practice was.
Absolutely. That pottery pattern was like their cultural stamp. But, the other 2 common names, they give us more insight into their social structure and maybe warfare. So we have the single grave culture. That describes their universal burial custom. They practiced inhumation, burying the body usually under small mounds or tumuli. And it was always individual and in a flexed, sort of crouched position.
And this was a major break from what came before.
Completely. A huge break from the preceding traditions of, those big collective burials and megalithic tombs.
And then the third name, the one that sounds maybe the most evocative of conflict.
That would be the battle axe culture, or sometimes people call it the boat axe culture, named for one of the most common grave offerings found with adult males. This highly distinctive, polished stone axe, usually shaped like a boat or, a battle weapon.
Okay, so clearly status symbols then.
Definitely. Suggesting an emphasis on individual prowess or maybe political or ritual authority among the men. So yeah, you have the pottery, the burial type, and the axe. Those are kind of the 3 unifying cultural traits we see everywhere.
Right. Now let's talk about the sheer logistics of this culture. It spans nearly 700 years, you said. But the geographic reach, starting around 3000 BC, it's almost incomprehensible for a society that wasn't like a state.
It is truly enormous. I mean, imagine drawing a single archaeological line across Europe. This culture covered almost the entirety of continental northern, central, and eastern Europe. We are talking from the Rhine in the west, so modern-day Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, Czech Republic, Austria, all the way across to the Volga River in the east, stretching deep into European Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic states.
And Scandinavia, too.
Yep, it even reached the maritime areas of Scandinavia, so coastal Norway, southern parts of Sweden and Finland. It's just vast.
That is a staggering expanse.
Yeah.
It sounds like a proto-empire or some kind of massive political entity, but you mentioned the sources always caution against seeing the Corded Ware as like a single unified culture.
And that caution is absolutely vital. Archaeologists are pretty adamant that CWC wasn't a monolithic, unified culture or state in the way we think of it now.
You're right.
I mean, when you have groups spread over thousands of miles from the Baltic coast to the Russian steppe forest zone, they're naturally going to develop wildly different ways of surviving, different economies based on their local environment, right?
Makes sense.
The differences in their settlements, their architecture, how they used resources, they were significant across that enormous area.
So how did these three things, the pot, the axe, the single grave, how did they manage to hold together a cultural network that spanned all these differences across, well, half a continent?
It really suggests a shared ideology, or maybe a lingua franca, a shared language, perhaps, that provided the framework for interaction, for trade, maybe even marriage alliances across these vast distances.
So the unity was more ideological?
Yeah, the cultural unity seems to come down to those three unifying markers. They represent a shared belief system about death, about status, and maybe the proper way to conduct ritual life. It's like a very successful early historical network, or maybe even a franchise, rather than a single unified political thing.
Okay, and we should probably briefly mention where it fits geographically with other cultures at the time. West of the Elbe, Corded Ware overlapped with the western edge of the bell beaker culture.
Right, that's a really important connection, yeah. Because the bell beaker phenomenon, that quickly took off across Western Europe and the British Isles. And it often inherited or synthesized traits that actually started in the corded ware zone.
Okay.
Their interaction, especially around the Rhine area, might have been really instrumental in launching that later bell beaker tradition across the continent. But, where the bell beaker people often benefited from quite sophisticated trade via sea and river routes,
Yeah.
the CWC, despite its massive land presence, was fundamentally continental. They really relied on overland routes, which, when you think about it, makes the transmission of their cultural traits even more impressive.
Okay, so we've defined the geographical and chronological scope. Now here's where we really hit the deep dive territory, the origins. The corded ware culture has been, well, deeply tangled up with the biggest unresolved issue in archaeology, the Indo-European or Heimat problem.
Ah, yes, the homeland question.
Exactly. For the listener, that's the search for the original homeland of the Indo-European language family.
And historically, based on their rapid, seemingly intrusive expansion, their use of horses, this perceived warlike nature symbolized by those battle axes. The CWC itself was sometimes thought to be that central homeland. Right, that was the older idea. But today, that consensus has largely, well, evaporated, hasn't it, in favor of the steppe hypothesis.
That's right. Pointing to the Pontic-Caspian steppe centered around the powerful Yamnaya culture. That's the widely accepted consensus now. But the CWC remains absolutely critical in this picture.
How so?
Well, autosomal genetic studies, especially those landmark findings published around 2015, they suggest that the CWC didn't just absorb Yamnaya influence. It seems to have originated from a massive migration of Yamnaya-related people moving west and north from that steppe forest zone into late Neolithic Europe, right around 3000 BC.
And the genetic data was revolutionary because it showed not just cultural influence, but actual demographic replacement.
It was a demographic shockwave, basically. Late Neolithic German samples suddenly showed this stunning, 75% genetic similarity to the DNA recovered from Yamnaya burials way out on the steppe.
75%, wow.
Yeah, our sources even cite a Harvard Magazine article referring to the populations as cousins who were, quote, biologically separated by only a few hundred years.
Incredible.
That level of similarity, it strongly indicates recent common ancestry and a massive rapid demographic shift, where a large portion of the existing Neolithic population was genetically replaced, essentially, by incoming steppe groups.
That concept alone, a mass migration introducing what we call steppe ancestry into Central Europe, where it was pretty much absent before, that's monumental.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the genetics present this massive, specific contradiction, especially regarding the paternal lineage.
This is the central paradox, the thing that continues to challenge that neat Yamnaya equals CWC narrative. While the autosomal DNA, that's the DNA shared by both sexes, showed that high similarity.
Yeah.
The specific paternal lines, the Y DNA haplogroups, they didn't align so neatly. The vast majority of Yamnaya males sampled, they mainly carried R1BZ2103.
Okay, R1D for Yamnaya. But the majority of CWC males sampled in Central Europe carried a different, though related, marker, R1A M417.
Exactly, R1A for corded ware.
So if the Yamnaya migrated en masse, Why didn't they bring their R1BY DNA with them in the direct paternal line? That doesn't quite add up.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If CWC was a direct descendant population, you'd absolutely expect to see strong paternal continuity. That R1A dominance, it suggests a different, much more complex origin story.
So what are the theories?
Well, one theory, supported by people like Christensen and others, posits that CWC didn't descend directly from the Yamnaya male line we sampled, but maybe evolved in parallel with it.
Ah, okay.
They were exposed to the same broad steppe cultural and genetic horizon, but the specific group that moved west wasn't necessarily the R1B dominant Yamnaya found way out in the Samara region.
Meaning they weren't the direct sons of the Samari Yamnaya guys. They were more like cousins, originating from a neighboring group or maybe slightly older, or just geographically distinct steppe-adjacent population.
Precisely. Hawk and colleagues, in their original 2015 paper, they actually cautioned that the sampled Yamnaya individuals from Samara might not be the direct ancestors. They suggested the true source might be a more western Yamnaya population, or perhaps even an earlier pre-Yamnaya steppe population that already carried that key R1A marker.
So R1A wasn't totally new?
No, not at all. What's crucial to remember is that R1A was present among earlier Eastern European hunter-gatherers, even if it wasn't the dominant line in the classic Yamnaya samples we first studied.
Okay, so this inherent complexity, this kind of messiness, it gives rise to the polyethnic model, right?
Yeah.
Which tries to bridge the gap and account for all the different bits of DNA we see.
Yeah, the polyethnic model. It gained traction with findings from Popek and colleagues more recently. It suggests that the early corded ware wasn't genetically uniform at all. It was a synthesis.
A mix.
A mix, exactly. Resulting from Yamnaya-related migrants maybe carrying R1B, initially agglomerating, mixing with local groups, specifically the indigenous populations like the funnel beaker and globular amphora cultures who are already there.
And the data supporting that synthesis is fascinating, especially when you look at gender.
It really is. Studies of early Bohemian corded ware, for instance, found that 100% of the individuals sampled who lacked the incoming steppe ancestry were female.
100%.
100%, which suggests a classic scenario of incoming, perhaps R1B carrying males of steppe background, being highly successful in assimilating local funnel beaker or globular amphora women into their new culture. They were bringing the steppe language and culture, sure, but incorporating local maternal DNA.
Okay, but then how does the R1A marker become the overwhelming winner later on,
Yeah.
if the initial wave might have been more mixed or even R1B led?
Is the enduring mystery. It seems that over time, within the CWC structure, maybe through social advantage, military success, economic factors, who knows, the R1A M417 lineage, which might have been present in the initial migrant wave, but maybe at lower levels, or maybe came from a specific subgroup, it just became dramatically dominant.
Really dominant.
Yeah, one analysis estimated that R1A M417 males had something like 15% more surviving offspring per generation compared to other males in the later corded ware communities.
Wow, that's a huge reproductive advantage.
It's massive. So whatever the precise mechanism, the CWC, while clearly genetically linked to the Yamnaya, very quickly developed its own distinct R1A signature. And that established the foundational paternal lineage for much of later Central and Northern Europe.
Okay, so moving from the monumental findings of genetics to the more practical side of daily life, one of the oldest debates surrounding the CWC centered on their lifestyle, right? Were they settled farmers or entirely nomadic pastoralists?
Yeah, that's a classic one. The traditional view really saw them as exclusively mobile herders, much like the Yamnaya, and that was largely because their settlements were incredibly ephemeral, really hard to find archaeologically compared to the thousands of highly visible individual graves they left behind.
Right, which fueled that sort of romantic idea of a purely mobile Indo-European society just focused on their herds of cattle.
Exactly. But if they were pure pastoralists, it's hard to see how they could have sustained that population density across Central Europe.
So what evidence changed that view?
Well, the modification came from sites like Bronisus in southeast Poland. That site yielded clear traces of sedentary agriculture. Things like emmer, common wheat, and barley were found, so we know they were farming.
Okay, so they did farm. But the challenge is, if they had fixed agriculture, why are their settlements so hard to find?
That's the puzzle. It suggests maybe a hybrid lifestyle, perhaps seasonal farming combined with significant pastoral mobility, or maybe their settlements were just built of materials like wood and thatch that simply didn't survive well in the archaeological record, unlike the enduring stone-built structures of previous Neolithic groups.
Makes sense. And they definitely used technology inherited from the people before them, like the funnel beaker culture.
Oh, yes, including wheeled vehicles, presumably drawn by oxen, which of course would aid both farming and mobility.
And their animal husbandry, it was quite specialized, wasn't it? Extending beyond just food production.
Absolutely. Our sources confirm systematic use of cow's milk in the northern Alpine foreland from as early as 3400 BC, which suggests pretty widespread lactose tolerance, a trait we know is strongly associated with that incoming steppe ancestry.
Right, the milk connection.
And furthermore, over in western Switzerland, we find evidence of specialization for non-food products. Changes in the slaughter age and the overall size of sheep indicate that they were probably being kept primarily for their wool.
Ah, so a textile economy.
Suggests a sophisticated textile economy, yeah. Which likely linked them into broader trade networks, maybe influenced by stronger Mediterranean contact further west.
So their economy was clearly mixed, adaptable, focused on mobility, but also using stationary resources when needed. Now let's look closer at the cultural subgroups, because they highlight this regional adaptation, don't they?
They really do. The Middle Dnieper culture, for example, is geographically crucial. It's recognized as a formative, very early expression of the Corded Ware culture. It basically acted as the key geographical and chronological bridge linking the Yamnaya territory to the Central European CWC heartland. It was like the entry point.
Okay, the bridge. Then we have the prototypical group, the Schneekeramic culture in Central Europe, Germany, Poland. That's the classic model, known for the cord-decorated pottery found with both men and women in their individual graves.
Right, the textbook example.
Yeah.
But the Scandinavian battle axe culture gives us a really important window into adaptation. We know of about 3,000 of those stone axes found across Scandinavia.
3,000, wow.
But what's critical is that archaeologists note strong continuities in local stonecraft techniques and even burial placement with the preceding indigenous funnel beaker culture.
So does that continuity argue against the massive migration we saw in the genetics? Or complicate it?
It complicates it, definitely. It doesn't necessarily argue against it, but it forces us to be more nuanced. It suggests that while the genetics indicate a major population shift, the incoming CWC groups in Scandinavia didn't necessarily just violently replace every single local person.
Okay.
Instead, they probably participated in a broader continental network of change, maybe adopting some local material styles, assimilating at a social level, even as the new genes eventually became dominant.
And their economy up there was uniquely maritime, reflecting their geography.
Oh, very much so. Einar Esmo emphasizes that the North Sea and Atlantic coastal regions where they settled were really unified by a vigorous maritime economy.
So the sea was a highway.
It's a powerful image. For these cultures, the sea wasn't a boundary, it was a highway, literally. The extensive rock carvings of ships assigned to this era, they suggest the vital importance of maritime trade. And this probably gave these coastal corded ware groups a very different and perhaps even closer cultural unity than the more spread out inland continental groups achieved.
And this shift we see with them, it's also social, isn't it? They moved dramatically away from the collective megalithic graves and mass sacrifices of the funnel beaker culture.
Right.
Towards those single individual graves and individual sacrifices we noted earlier. That seems like a powerful indication of a movement toward emphasizing the individual, maybe the warrior or the patriarch, redefining who mattered in society.
Absolutely. It signals a fundamental shift in social organization and ideology.
Let's focus now on those individual graves, because they are the most enduring archaeological feature of the corded ware world. And the details surrounding the burial ritual were incredibly rigid, yet somehow geographically variable.
Yeah, the single grave custom was universal. Didn't matter which region or subgroup you look at. Inhumation, flexed position, either in a flat grave or under a small earth mound, a tumulus. But the key to understanding their cosmos, their worldview, lies in the orientation system. It was rigorously gendered and directionally determined.
Okay, so what were the rules for the main continental corded ware groups?
In the core continental CWC areas, so think Germany and Poland, males were laid on their right side and females were laid on their left side.
Okay, right side male, left side female.
Exactly. And crucially, the bodies of both sexes were oriented so that they face the south.
Facing south.
Yeah, this orientation is highly deliberate. It's likely linked to solar or lunar cycles, maybe dictating their view of the afterlife or the spirit world. Very precise.
But the rules flip if you move north and east, right?
That's where the regional variation kicks in, yeah. Which confirms that while the idea of individual gendered burial was shared across the whole CWC world, the application was local.
How did it change?
Well, in Sweden and parts of northern Poland, the graves were oriented north-south instead. And men were laid on their left side, women on their right side, so the opposite sides.
Okay.
But in that case, both sexes faced east.
Facing east instead of south.
Right, so it shows that the concept of individual gendered burial was definitely a pan-CWC trait. But the specific cosmological rules about which direction the soul departed or which way the body should lie, they changed dramatically, reflecting distinct regional beliefs.
Fascinating. And as for grave goods, we mentioned men usually got the stone battle axe as a status marker,
Yes.
while both sexes commonly received the cord-decorated pottery. This emphasis on individual status and these gendered goods, it reinforces that profound alteration we talked about, the shift away from deep, collective ancestral reverence symbolized by those huge communal Neolithic tombs.
It really is a move toward a society where the individual lineage, or perhaps the living family unit rather than the collective clan, becomes the primary unit of social structure. The burial rite itself becomes more like a personal monument rather than a group effort over generations.
Okay, this brings us to a specific kind of controversial anecdote, one that became huge media fodder, but actually serves as a fascinating example of how complex these rigid rules might have been to interpret or enforce the Prague burial from 2011.
Yes, the Prague burial. It's a perfect case study in the perils of archaeological interpretation when you find an anomaly, something that doesn't fit the pattern.
What was the find?
An untypical corded ware burial was discovered in a suburb of Prague. The skeleton was identified as biologically male based on the skeletal markers, but it was oriented in the manner prescribed for female burials, so on the right side facing south.
The female position.
Exactly. And it lacked any of the typical gender-specific grave goods, like a battle axe, nothing that screamed male status.
So when the news broke, the initial media narrative was pretty swift and sensational, wasn't it?
Oh, extremely. Archaeologists initially suggested that because funeral rites were so important and so strictly adhered to in the CWC, this was unlikely to be just an accident or a mistake.
Right, they thought it must be deliberate.
Which led to speculation that the individual was possibly transgender or perhaps homosexual, and that created the unforgettable, if highly inaccurate, headline, "The world's first gay caveman."
Ugh, gay caveman.
Yeah. That phrase drew immediate and very necessary criticism, of course, primarily because it's chronologically completely wrong. We're talking Copper Age, thousands of years after any caveman.
Right.
And also because it imposes modern sociosexual concepts onto a Copper Age person's gender role, which is just methodologically unsound. But the underlying archaeological dilemma remained. Why did the living break the rules for this specific dead person?
Setting aside the sensationalism, what specific archaeological detail was so compelling that the experts initially risked making such a controversial interpretation? Why not just say anomaly?
It was the rigidity, the sheer standardization of the corded ware practice across these vast distances. An intentional deviation seemed to imply a really special circumstance, possibly related to a social status or an identity that somehow defied the norm.
But critical analysis offered broader, maybe more culturally specific interpretations.
Exactly. Archaeologist Martin Turak, for instance, he noted that there are actually several examples of corded ware graves containing older biological males buried with typically female grave goods and body orientations. It wasn't unique.
Oh, okay. So what was Turak's suggestion then?
He suggested, and I quote, that aged men may have decided to retire as women for symbolic and practical reasons.
Retire as women. Interesting.
Yeah, it could be a reflection of specific third gender roles existing in their society, maybe a shift in status in old age, or some kind of symbolic retirement from the warrior class. The point is, it exemplifies the complex, often symbolic nature of ancient social roles that just cannot be reduced to simple modern definitions. It reminds us that gender roles and identities in the past were structured by their own unique cosmos, their own worldview.
Okay, let's return now to perhaps the biggest legacy of the CWC language. The general consensus today is that the CWC was a massive linguistic vector responsible for spreading Indo-European languages across much of Europe.
Yeah, that consensus places the Corded Ware culture right at the geolinguistic core. Ancestral to several major branches of Indo-European, essentially all of the Western branches, really, that evolved following the much earlier divergence of Anatolian and Tocharian.
So which specific branches are we talking about?
Specifically, CWC is strongly linked to the origins of the Italo-Celtic languages, Germanic languages, and the Balto-Slavic languages.
Right, David Anthony's model that offers one of the most compelling geographical and chronological mechanisms for this dispersal, doesn't it? How did he break down the CWC's linguistic impact?
Anthony proposed a geographical split that's rooted in the CWC expansion itself. He suggested that the Slavic and Baltic languages probably developed in that crucial bridge region, the Middle Dnieper culture, which linked the steppes in Central Europe.
Okay, the starting point.
Meanwhile, pre-Germanic dialects may have developed slightly to the southeast, possibly within the adjacent Usatov culture, and then spread with the CWC migration northwards into Northern Europe, eventually reaching Scandinavia.
And the others? Celtic and Italic.
Pre-Celtic and pre-Italic, in his model, developed further south, perhaps in regions like Hungary, after that initial steppe wave reached the Danube Valley. So different branches budding off as the migration spread.
The spread of the language itself, though, it brings us back to that core tension we found in the genetics section. How did the language actually transmit? Was it through a small, successful elite imposing their language, or simply sheer numbers of migrants?
That's the big debate. The elite recruitment versus the strength of numbers theory. Anthony initially championed the elite recruitment model.
Right.
He proposed that language spread primarily through powerful ritual and political elites being emulated by local populations. Maybe because of their prestige, their mastery of horse technology, or their ritual knowledge. In that version, the language moves through social status, not necessarily mass population replacement.
But the genetic evidence from 2015 onwards? That really complicated that theory, didn't it? By showing the sheer magnitude of the migration.
Exactly. When a genetic data came out revealing that massive migration of Yamnaya-related people, and critically, with both sexes participating, meaning whole families were moving, it shifted the debate entirely.
Right.
This forced Anthony and other geneticists to concede that the steppe hypothesis, applied through the Corded Ware context, it doesn't require elite dominance anymore. Instead, the languages could well have been introduced simply by strength of numbers. A major folk migration that fundamentally altered the demography of Europe and just overwhelmed the existing linguistic landscape.
The scale of that demographic and linguistic change must have been revolutionary. It implies that the Indo-Europeanization of Europe caused a massive, largely unrecorded linguistic extinction event.
It must have been a linguistic cataclysm, yeah. I mean, imagine the diversity of tongues across Neolithic Europe, languages completely unrelated to one another, we assume, suddenly being replaced by one successful incoming language family. Through language shift, where populations just adopted the IE tongue and dropped their native one over generations.
And we know very little about what was spoken before.
Very little. The pre-Indo-European linguistic landscape of Europe is largely lost to us. Basque, spoken in the Pyrenees, is the most famous isolated exception that somehow survived this massive wave.
The CWC's interaction with the existing cultures also fueled that famous Proto-Germanic substratum debate, didn't it? And that must have been a huge area of discussion for linguists for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. Maria Gimbutas and her followers, they theorized that when the Corded Ware intruded into Scandinavia and synthesized, mixed with the indigenous funnel beaker culture, that specific cultural clash gave rise to Proto-Germanic.
Okay.
She suggested that up to 30% of the vocabulary, the non-Indo-European elements in Proto-Germanic, derive from those indigenous funnel beaker speakers.
30%, that's a lot.
It is. It would mean Proto-Germanic was essentially an Indo-Europeanized language built on a significant pre-IE foundation, reflecting a real linguistic merger.
What's the modern linguistic view on the size of that foundational element now? Has that idea held up?
Well, the modern consensus has significantly scaled back the extent of that substratum influence. Recent linguists have substantially reduced the number of words claimed as uniquely Germanic or non-IE roots. The current tendency is more to reject or at least heavily question the extensive Germanic substrate hypothesis.
So the thinking now is the influence was minor.
Relatively minor, yeah. Which, again, sort of reinforces the idea that the incoming CWC linguistic core was powerful enough to essentially dictate the new language structure, rather than merging equally or significantly with the local tongue.
So The Corded Ware culture clearly laid the groundwork for much of Central and Northern European society later on. We can see its genetic and cultural descendants forming the backbone of the Bronze Age, particularly in the West.
Exactly. Genetic studies show a really close continuous relationship between the CWC and the succeeding cultures of the Bronze Age. They form the genetic foundation for the bell beaker culture, which spread west, the Unitas culture in Central Europe, and of course the Nordic Bronze Age across Scandinavia.
And that genetic continuity has fascinating practical implications, even for understanding their diet. You mentioned lactose tolerance earlier.
It does. It's surely no coincidence that the Corded Ware people and their direct descendants in the Nordic Bronze Age show the highest levels of lactose tolerance among all Bronze Age Europeans sampled.
Right.
This is a clear biological marker of that pastoralist lifestyle package brought from the steppes, demonstrating the successful survival and propagation of that specific trait within the CWC population and its heirs.
But here's where the ripples spread perhaps farthest, and this is really mind-blowing: the critical eastward path. The Corded Ware culture wasn't just a sink for the Yamnaya migration coming west. It became a sophisticated launchpad for future migrations that profoundly impacted Asia.
This is the lineage that connects Europe back to the origins of the Indo-Iranians.
Yeah.
You know, the peoples who would eventually settle Persia and India and speak languages like Sanskrit and Avestan.
How does that work?
Well, the initial CWC expansion into Eastern Europe led directly to the formation of the Middle Dnieper culture, which we mentioned as the bridge. That then gave rise to the Fekinovo-Balanovo culture, located further east on the upper Volga River. This was essentially CWC people moving far deeper into European Russia.
Okay, pushing east. And how does that connect specifically to the origins of the Indo-Iranians?
The Fekinovo-Balanovo culture contributed directly to the Abashevo culture, which is recognized as a clear predecessor to the Proto-Indo-Iranian Santasta culture. It's like a precise chain of cultural transmission moving step by step eastward.
So wait, the CWC, a population that synthesized steppe ancestry with Central European Neolithic ancestry, then migrated back eastward into the steppe. That sounds like a historical reversal almost.
That is precisely what the genetics confirms, and it's why this is so critical and frankly unexpected until the DNA came in. Studies show that the Santashta culture, which is the widely accepted ancestor of the Indo-Iranians, emerged as a result of an eastward remigration of CWC peoples. They were essentially a hybrid Central European population, now carrying that dominant R1A paternal lineage we talked about, migrating back into the steppe, settling and innovating like crazy. They created the first successful large-scale chariot and advanced metallurgy culture, which then rapidly spread the Indo-Iranian languages and genes south and east across Central Asia.
That's incredible. So they took the steppe culture, mixed it with local European traditions and genes, developed it further, and then remigrated it back to the east, leading to monumental cultural shifts in two separate continents, Europe and Asia.
It connects the genetics of, say, the Nordic Bronze Age directly to the genetics of the Santashta and later Andronovo cultures out on the Eurasian steppe. The genetic data is really clear now. These subsequent Eastern steppe cultures, Santashta, Podopovka, Abashevo, Srubnaya, were ultimately derived from this remigration of Central European peoples who carried that mixed steppe European ancestry. It's a return migration that carried the CWC genetic and cultural signature deep into Asia.
And we can trace this foundational event right into modern populations today, can't we? Demonstrating the lasting success of this whole expansion.
Absolutely. Modern autosomal DNA tests estimate a significant, lasting ancestral contribution from that initial migration pulse, introduced primarily via the CWC-Yamnaya horizon. It ranges from about 40% to maybe 54% of the total ancestral DNA found in modern Central and Northern Europeans today.
Huge.
It is undeniably one of the foundational demographic events of the entire European continent, shaping its populations for the next 5 millennia. Hashtag outro. So in synthesis, the Corded Ware culture was clearly far more than just a style of pottery. It represents this incredibly dynamic, geographically vast, and genetically complex cultural horizon that fundamentally reshaped the genetics, the languages, the whole social structure of continental Europe.
A massive and rapid social transformation.
Absolutely. Linking the pastoral world of the Pontic-Caspian steppes all the way to the forests and coasts of Scandinavia, and forever altering the social and genetic fabric of the continent through both migration and hybridization.
It's an incredible story of expansion and cultural dominance. But for all the clarity we've gained through genetics about the size of the migration, that fundamental paradox of the male line still remains, doesn't it?
It does.
The initial source population, the Yamnaya dominated by R1b, yet their rapid cultural and genetic descendants across Europe, the CWC dominated by R1a.
The missing link still.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. Given the intense genetic evidence showing the dominance of R1a in the Corded Ware culture, but also that deep autosomal link back to the R1b dominant Yamnaya culture, what specific non-Yamnaya population carrying that crucial R1a marker might represent the true missing link? The group that synthesized with the initial step of migrants really kickstart this whole pan-European transformation.
Were they neighbors back on the steppe? Rivals? Or simply a highly successful outlier group, maybe from the forest steppe zone, that joined the westward movement and then, through some advantage, genetically outpaced the R1b migrants as they moved into Neolithic Europe?
The full story of the Corded Ware culture's ultimate origins is clearly still being written. And those R1a ancestors, whoever they were precisely, seem to hold the